It began with a meeting no one expected to become emotional. Behind the heavy doors of Clarence House, Princess Anne reportedly delivered words that changed the atmosphere of the monarchy in an instant. Meghan Markle's name, once avoided in tense family discussions, was suddenly placed at the center of a deeply personal royal conversation. And according to insiders, what Anne confirmed left several senior royals stunned into silence. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the gathering had been arranged quietly, under the shadow of King Charles's ongoing health struggles, at a time when the palace was already moving carefully, speaking carefully, and protecting every fragile thread of stability it still had. But this meeting, insiders whisper, did not feel like routine family business. It carried a heavier weight. Senior aides were reportedly seen moving in and out with unusual urgency, their silence saying more than any official statement ever could. No one wanted this conversation to leak. No one wanted Meghan's name dragged back into the center of royal debate. And yet, according to those familiar with the mood inside Clarence House, Princess Anne believed the matter could no longer be pushed aside. For years, Meghan's position had remained one of the most uncomfortable questions inside the House of Windsor. Was she still merely a distant member of the family by marriage, living outside royal duty, outside palace control, outside the old code of service? Or did her influence over Prince Harry still make her a powerful presence in the monarchy's private future? That, reports suggest, was the question Anne forced into the open. And once Harry's name was mentioned, the atmosphere reportedly shifted. What had begun as a cautious discussion became something far more emotional, because behind every debate about protocol stood a father, a son, a wounded family, and a crown trying desperately not to fracture further. King Charles, according to palace whispers, appeared exhausted and deeply conflicted, not merely as monarch, but as a father caught between duty and grief. Anne's words allegedly carried no cruelty, but they carried finality. She was not speaking to embarrass Meghan. She was speaking, insiders claim, to define the limits of trust. The monarchy could not keep pretending that distance had solved everything. It could not ignore the unresolved pain, the public wounds, the private anxieties, or the quiet fear that one more emotional rupture could shake the institution at its weakest moment. And in that room, the conversation reportedly became what one insider described as a family reckoning years in the making. Anne, iron-willed and unshaken, appeared to say what others had only whispered. Meghan's position could no longer be treated as unclear, because uncertainty itself had become dangerous. Every future invitation, every family ceremony, every gesture of reconciliation would now carry consequences. The palace had reached the point where emotion and institution could no longer be separated. But what truly shook the palace was not simply Anne's confirmation, it was the reason she believed the conversation could no longer be avoided. For years, the monarchy attempted to project unity. Public smiles, carefully managed appearances, and carefully worded statements hid what many insiders described as a growing fracture inside the House of Windsor. But according to reports now surfacing from royal circles, the divide surrounding Meghan Markle had quietly become impossible to contain. After Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal duties, the palace tried to frame the separation as manageable, even dignified. There were statements about love, family, and respect. There were reminders that the door was not entirely closed. But behind that careful language, reports suggest trust had been damaged in ways that could not easily be repaired. Palace staff, already trained to survive pressure without complaint, allegedly became more guarded whenever the Sussex camp was mentioned. Conversations became shorter. Decisions became slower. Every possible gesture of warmth was measured against the risk of another public rupture. And over time, what began as personal pain reportedly hardened into something far more serious. Royal commentators allegedly warned that the divide was no longer just emotional, it had become institutional. That meant the problem was not only about hurt feelings between relatives, it was about access, titles, future ceremonies, private information, and the fragile public image of a monarchy already under strain. Meghan's name, insiders claim, carried two different meanings inside royal circles. To some, she remained Harry's wife and the mother of royal grandchildren. To others, she represented uncertainty, exposure, and a chapter the palace could not fully control. This is where Princess Anne's role allegedly became impossible to ignore. During King Charles's illness, Anne was increasingly described as one of the stabilizing forces inside the family. The person who understood that sentiment could not be allowed to weaken the structure of the crown. While Charles carried the heartbreak of a father, Anne carried the burden of an institution. She had watched the old disagreements return again and again, each one dressed in new language, but rooted in the same fear. Could the monarchy invite Meghan closer without risking another storm? William and Catherine, according to palace whispers, reportedly favored stricter boundaries. Not out of cruelty, but out of protection. Protection for their children. Protection for the future reign. Protection for a royal household that could not afford endless uncertainty. Their position, insiders suggest, was shaped by experience. They had seen how quickly private tensions could become public drama, how carefully planned moments could be overshadowed, and how the monarchy's dignity could be dragged into emotional battles it never openly chose. Meanwhile, Meghan's public image continued to divide people on both sides of the royal divide. Supporters saw a woman who had challenged an ancient institution. Critics saw someone whose presence had changed the family's balance forever. Inside the palace, that split reportedly became exhausting. No matter what decision was made, someone would call it cold, weak, unfair, or dangerous. And that was the trap Anne believed the family had fallen into. Silence was no longer protecting peace. It was preserving confusion. So when old disagreements resurfaced in recent family discussions, they did not arrive as memories. They arrived as warnings. Every unresolved wound seemed to point toward the same question, and every answer carried a cost. And as old wounds reopened behind palace walls, Anne reportedly prepared to reveal the one thing she believed the family needed to hear, even if it shattered what little peace remained. Those familiar with the palace's inner workings say Princess Anne rarely speaks emotionally during official family discussions, which is why the silence reportedly falling across the room after her intervention became so unforgettable. This was not a ceremonial statement. It was described as deeply personal and impossible to ignore. Anne, according to insiders, did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her strength has always come from restraint, from that hard royal discipline built over decades of duty, grief, scandal, and service. But in that meeting, reports suggest she spoke with a force that went beyond protocol. She allegedly reminded the room that the crown could survive disagreement, but it could not survive endless uncertainty. It could not keep bleeding privately while smiling publicly. It could not allow emotion to override duty every time Meghan's name returned to the center of the family's most painful conversations. The phrase that reportedly struck the room hardest was simple: duty before emotion. Not because it sounded cold, but because it carried the weight of everything the monarchy had been forced to endure. Harry's departure. Meghan's transformation from working royal to distant figure of controversy. The interviews, the accusations, the public divisions, the uncomfortable anniversaries, the family milestones shadowed by absence. Anne allegedly acknowledged that Meghan's impact had not ended when she stepped back from royal life. It had continued through Harry, through public perception, through every difficult decision the palace made about access, invitations, and trust. King Charles, insiders claim, listened in silence. And that silence reportedly became one of the most emotional parts of the meeting. He was not only hearing a senior royal discuss strategy, he was hearing his sister speak about his son, his daughter-in-law, and the wound that had followed the family through years of public turmoil. For Charles, the issue was never only institutional. It was deeply personal. But for Anne, the personal pain could no longer be allowed to weaken the institution. That was the brutal tension at the heart of the room. Several senior royals were reportedly visibly affected as Anne continued, not because she attacked Meghan, but because she allegedly spoke the truth many had avoided. Unresolved tensions were no longer sitting quietly in the background. They were shaping the future. They were influencing how William and Catherine protected their household, how aides handled sensitive information, how family invitations were discussed, and how every public gesture was interpreted by millions. Reconciliation, once spoken of as a hopeful possibility, now seemed far more complicated. Could trust be rebuilt after so much damage? Could the monarchy welcome back emotional closeness without reopening old wounds? Or had the divide already become too deep? The meeting, according to palace whispers, lasted far longer than originally planned, because no one could easily close a conversation that touched every nerve of the modern monarchy. Each answer led to another question. Each memory reopened another concern. And Anne's intervention, while calm, reportedly forced the family to confront what silence had hidden for too long. Compassion had limits. Forgiveness required structure. And peace, if it ever came, could not be built on denial. But while Anne's words appeared compassionate on the surface, insiders claimed there was another layer to the discussion, one connected to the monarchy's future itself. According to various interpretations of the meeting, Princess Anne's confirmation was not about titles, ceremonies, or appearances. It was about influence, about whether Meghan Markle still held emotional power over one of the monarchy's most vulnerable royal figures, and what that meant for the future of the crown. That was the question reportedly sitting beneath every careful sentence in the room. Not whether Meghan would return to balcony moments, not whether old privileges could be restored, and not whether the family could produce another public gesture of unity for the cameras. The deeper concern, insiders suggest, was far more unsettling. If Harry remained emotionally tied to decisions shaped outside palace control, then every future royal choice involving him carried risk. Access was no longer just access. An invitation was no longer just an invitation. Visibility was no longer just a family courtesy. Each one became a possible opening through which old wounds, private frustrations, and public controversy could return. Princess Anne, according to palace whispers, allegedly acknowledged this without drama but with devastating clarity. Meghan's influence over Harry, she reportedly suggested, could not be dismissed simply because the couple had built a life away from the working monarchy. Distance had not erased attachment. Separation had not removed consequence. Harry was still the king's son. He was still part of the royal bloodline, and because of that, Meghan's position remained complicated, not because she held formal power inside the institution, but because her presence still shaped one of its most painful fractures. Discussions allegedly turned toward the long-term impact of estrangement. What happens at major family events? Who is included? Who is excluded? And who decides? How does the palace protect private spaces when public trust has already been bruised? William, according to reports, was especially concerned with preserving institutional stability. For him, the matter was not only emotional, it was generational. Every decision made now could echo into the reign that awaits him. Every weak boundary could become tomorrow's crisis. And every attempt to avoid discomfort could leave the future crown carrying a heavier burden. Yet Anne reportedly viewed the issue as larger than personalities. This was not, insiders claim, a simple debate about liking or disliking Meghan. It was about whether the monarchy could keep functioning when family loyalty and institutional duty were pulling in opposite directions. Queen Elizabeth II's old disciplines seemed to hover over the discussion. Continuity first, duty always, the crown above personal desire. That principle had carried the monarchy through scandal, loss, and reinvention. And now, as Charles's reign struggled under illness and emotional strain, Anne appeared determined to keep that principle alive. The meeting, sources suggest, became a moment of difficult acceptance rather than open conflict. There was no need for raised voices when the truth itself was heavy enough. Meghan's future position, as reportedly framed by Anne, was not a restoration, not a banishment, and not a simple label. It was a boundary. A recognition that influence without duty could not be treated the same as service with sacrifice. And yet, the deeper the conversation went, the clearer it became that this was no longer only about Meghan or Harry, it was about the monarchy preparing for a future no one wanted to confront. Few figures inside the monarchy appear more torn than King Charles III. Reports surrounding the emotional meeting suggest the king struggled visibly, as Princess Anne laid out the realities facing the family. Because at the center of every painful discussion was a father confronting a divide he may never fully repair. For Charles, the issue was never just Meghan's position or Harry's distance. It was the unbearable collision between two identities he could not escape. He was the king, expected to guard the crown with discipline, restraint, and iron loyalty to the institution. But he was also a father, watching one son stand at the heart of the monarchy's future, while the other remained painfully separated from the family's inner circle. Reports suggest that during the meeting, Charles appeared physically drained, weighed down not only by illness, but by the emotional cost of ruling a family that could no longer agree on what healing should look like. Anne, according to palace whispers, allegedly urged him to look beyond personal longing and focus on institutional stability. That was not an easy message for a brother to hear from a sister, and certainly not an easy message for a father to accept. But Anne's position was said to be brutally clear: the monarchy could not be guided by guilt. It could not shape its future around fear of upsetting Harry, nor could it ignore Meghan's continued influence simply because the topic was painful. In her view, compassion without boundaries had become dangerous, and silence had allowed uncertainty to grow into a force of its own. Harry's absence reportedly weighed heavily over the room. Not as a distant headline, but as a living wound. Every mention of future family events, every question about access, every discussion about reconciliation seemed to circle back to the same ache. Charles wanted peace, but the crown required protection. Senior royals were allegedly divided between those who still believed a careful path back could be found, and those who feared that reopening the door too widely would invite another round of turmoil. That divide made the meeting feel less like a decision and more like a test of the monarchy's emotional limits. Behind the discussion, insiders claim, stood the long shadow of Queen Elizabeth II. Her legacy remained the silent measure against which every choice was judged. She had believed in continuity, in duty, in the painful art of placing the crown above personal need. Charles had inherited that burden, but under far more fragile circumstances. His health struggles had forced the palace to quietly prepare for future transitions. Even as the family tried to avoid saying out loud what everyone understood, the monarchy was entering a period where every weakness would be watched, every hesitation judged, and every unresolved family fracture magnified. And perhaps that is what frightened Charles most. Reports suggest he feared history repeating itself, not in the same form, but with the same heartbreaking pattern of distance, resentment, and public pain. A monarchy built on continuity could not afford endless rupture. A father could hope. A king had to decide. And as those two truths pressed against him, the room reportedly grew heavier, as if everyone understood that no answer would heal everything. But as the meeting finally came to an end, one chilling realization reportedly lingered in the room longer than anything Anne had said aloud. When the doors finally opened, aides reportedly avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped abruptly, and even veteran palace staff sensed something had shifted. Whatever Princess Anne confirmed during that emotional gathering, insiders claim its impact reached far beyond one difficult family discussion. In the hours that followed, the palace reportedly moved into its oldest mode of survival: silence. No statement, no clarification, no careful line offered to soften the growing whispers. Royal aides were allegedly instructed to say nothing about the meeting. And that silence only made the atmosphere feel more charged, because inside the monarchy, silence is rarely empty. It can be protection. It can be punishment. It can be strategy. And in this case, insiders suggest it felt like all three at once. Speculation quickly intensified among royal commentators and media insiders. Some believed Anne had simply drawn a practical boundary around Meghan's future involvement. Others suspected the conversation had gone much deeper, touching the fragile question of whether Harry could ever be fully trusted inside the palace circle again. But what unsettled people most was the absence of denial. The palace did not rush to dismiss the whispers. It did not flood the press with reassurance. Instead, the machinery of the crown appeared to tighten quietly, as if everyone understood that something sensitive had been decided, even if no one was ready to say it aloud. Reports suggest senior staff began reassessing future event planning almost immediately. Family ceremonies, memorial gatherings, major royal appearances, and private invitations were allegedly viewed through a new and colder lens. Not because anyone wanted fresh conflict, but because the cost of careless openness had become too high. Every seating plan, every guest list, every possible reunion now carried emotional weight. Meghan's position, Harry's absence, Charles's health, William's future, and Anne's intervention were no longer separate concerns. They had merged into one difficult question. How does a monarchy protect itself when the deepest threat may come from unresolved family pain? Anne reportedly left the meeting composed, but visibly burdened. That detail, if true, mattered. Anne is not known for theatrical emotion. She is known for endurance, duty, and an almost unforgiving steadiness. So when insiders described her as carrying the heaviness of the discussion, it suggested the decision had not been easy, even for her. She may have been the one strong enough to say what others avoided, but strength does not mean absence of feeling. Sometimes it means accepting the blame for a truth everyone else is afraid to carry. And that is why the mood afterward was described as heavier than expected. This was not triumph. It was not revenge. It was the cold aftershock of a family admitting that love alone could not repair what had been broken. Growing whispers now suggest the monarchy may be entering a decisive new chapter. One where sentiment is controlled, access is narrowed, and the future is protected with sharper discipline than before. And as royal watchers searched for answers, another question quietly began spreading through palace circles. What happens if the divide can never truly be healed? While Princess Anne reportedly carried the emotional weight of the meeting itself, insiders claim Prince William and Catherine delivered their response differently, through silence, distance, and a renewed focus on the future of the crown. And according to palace whispers, that silence may have spoken louder than words ever could. William, according to reports, understood exactly why Anne had spoken the way she did. He had watched the monarchy absorb shock after shock, each one dressed as a family matter, but felt as an institutional wound. To him, stability was not a cold idea. It was protection. Protection for the crown he would one day inherit, protection for the public trust that keeps the monarchy standing, and protection for a family already carrying more pressure than the outside world could fully see. Anne's emphasis on continuity reportedly aligned with what William had long believed. The future could not be built on uncertainty. Catherine, meanwhile, was said to remain focused on something even more personal, shielding her children from the turbulence surrounding the royal divide. For her, the issue was not only about Harry and Meghan, not only about palace strategy, and not only about the difficult choices facing King Charles. It was about George, Charlotte, and Louis, growing up under the weight of a family story they did not create. Reports suggest Catherine has become increasingly careful about what reaches her household, what is allowed near her children, and what emotional storms are permitted to touch the next generation of the monarchy. That caution, insiders whisper, has shaped the Wales family's quiet response. They did not need a dramatic declaration. They did not need public anger. Their answer was restraint. Controlled communication. Fewer risks. A clearer line between private family hope and royal responsibility. Behind the scenes, royal households were reportedly communicating with greater precision, as though every message now had to be weighed for consequence. The palace, bruised by years of public tension, appeared to be choosing calm over confrontation, not because the pain had disappeared, but because open conflict would only deepen it. And in that restrained silence, the future image of the monarchy became the central concern. William and Catherine know that their family represents more than themselves. They carry the expectation of renewal, the promise that the crown can move beyond old scandals and into a more disciplined era. But that promise cannot survive if the past keeps returning through unresolved bitterness. Public trust, once weakened, does not rebuild through words alone. It rebuilds through consistency, discipline, and the refusal to let personal emotion drag the institution into another cycle of spectacle. So while Anne may have spoken the hardest truth inside the meeting, William and Catherine reportedly carried that truth forward in their own way. Not with confrontation, but with distance. not with cruelty, but with caution. Their silence seemed to say that the monarchy's future would no longer be shaped by emotional pressure alone. It would be shaped by boundaries, by duty, and by the painful understanding that protecting the crown sometimes means stepping back from the people still tied to your heart. But even as the family attempted to regain control behind the scenes, the emotional consequences of Anne's confirmation were only beginning to unfold. In the end, insiders say Princess Anne's emotional confirmation was never truly about choosing sides. It was about acknowledging a painful reality the monarchy could no longer avoid. A family once defined by continuity now stands divided by distance, loyalty, and conflicting visions of what the crown should become. The meeting, according to palace whispers, marked the beginning of what some commentators now describe as a period of quiet restructuring. Not loud, not dramatic in public, but deliberate, careful, unforgiving in its discipline. Behind the polished language of royal duty, the monarchy was reportedly turning inward, studying its weaknesses, tightening its boundaries, and preparing for a future where every decision around Harry and Meghan would be measured against one question. Does this protect the crown, or does it expose it? Princess Anne, in that new reality, appeared more than ever like the stabilizing force of Charles's reign. While the king carried the pain of a father, Anne carried the steel of the institution. She understood that sympathy could not become strategy, and that love, however sincere, could not replace order. Her reported confirmation did not erase Harry and Meghan from the royal story. In many ways, it proved the opposite. Even from a distance, they remained emotionally tied to the monarchy's deepest wounds, still part of its public drama, still shaping decisions made behind closed doors. And that is what made the moment so powerful. The palace was no longer simply managing scandal. It was managing legacy, succession, survival, the future of William's reign, the protection of Catherine's children, the memory of Queen Elizabeth II, whose long life of duty still seemed to hover over every painful choice. Her belief was simple but severe: personal hurt must never be allowed to overpower the crown. That belief, insiders suggest, became the hidden foundation of Anne's intervention, and the quiet message carried through the family afterward. Royal watchers remain divided on whether reconciliation is still possible. Some believe time may soften the bitterness, that family bonds may one day prove stronger than public conflict. Others argue the damage has gone too deep, that trust once broken inside the monarchy does not return easily, especially when the world is watching every gesture, every absence, every careful silence. But what few dispute is that the emotional meeting symbolized a turning point. The old hope of effortless healing had faded. In its place stood something colder, more disciplined, and perhaps more realistic. Because within the House of Windsor, history has shown that titles may survive scandal, power may survive division, but the scars left behind by family conflict rarely disappear in silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.